Now, if I had to describe the global economy, to me it looks a bit like an airplane that has 4 engines: US/United Kingdom, Eurozone, Japan, China, and emerging markets. If you look at this airplane, it's trying to take off and then gain escape velocity. The only engine out of the 4 that right now looks like it's working okay is the United States and the United Kingdom, where right now growth rates are closer through 3%. If you look at the Eurozone, that engine has stalled. The Eurozone is probably one shock away from outright recession and double dip or triple dip recession. I was just in Japan, where also the reforms of Abenomics have stalled. The third hour of structural reform is not occurring. The increase of the consumption tax has stopped the economy in its tracks, and that's why the Bank of Japan had to do additional quantitative easing to try to boost the stock market, weaken the yen and the economy. So Japan looks also fragile. And China's had this very sharp economic slowdown. The only debate in China right now is whether there'll be a softer landing or a harder landing. I think the Chinese landing is going to be bumpy and rough. I don't believe in a total economic and financial meltdown, but the idea that China can happily keep on growing 7.5% the way the consensus and the government says, I think is far-fetched. China's done too much overinvestment in real estate, in infrastructure, in industrial capacity. The bad assets of the banks and the shadow banks are rising. The bad debts of the private and public sector are rising. And therefore, there'll be a sharp slowdown of China. And the only question is, can they rebalance their growth rate from investment towards consumption, from capital-intensive growth towards labor-intensive growth, as they were avoiding that hard landing. But in many ways, the fundamental problems of the Eurozone have not been resolved. Potential growth is low because structural reforms are occurring slowly. The actual economic recovery is extremely anemic because you don't have enough monetary and fiscal stimulus. Many of these countries have lost their competitiveness and have not been able to restore it yet. And the debt ratios of Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and many of the other countries in the periphery are still high and rising, both in the private and the public sector. And therefore, on a medium-term basis, those situations become kind of unsustainable. But, you know, after 2 other years of near recession and no job creation, there is austerity reform fatigue in the periphery of the Eurozone. Think what's happening. This anti-Euro party, Podemos, is now polling first in the polls in Spain. In Greece, Syriza, the party is against the Troika and against austerity reform, is maybe winning the election. In France, people say that in the first round of the presidential election, Marine Le Pen might be getting the most votes. And in Italy, Renzi is failing to do reforms. He has been in power for 9 months. He hasn't been able to do a single reform. He promised 1 per month. And if he fails, Italy might go back to Berlusconi, that is a disaster, or go to Grillo, that is another disaster. I don't know which one of those 2 disasters will be worse for Italy. So throughout the Eurozone periphery, you see austerity and bailout fatigue. And in the core of the Eurozone, you see instead bailout fatigue by the core. There are these anti-Euro parties even in Germany that are now getting a significant amount of the votes. So while in the short run, the Eurozone is still sticking together, over the medium term, the risk of a breakup is still there, one that you cannot fully rule out. And the biggest problem in the Eurozone is that while you need to do structural reform to boost potential growth, there is also a problem of aggregate demand in the Eurozone. It's not just a matter of aggregate supply. Of that 12% unemployment rate in the Eurozone, maybe 7-8 might be structural, but at least 3-4% of it is actually cyclical. There is not enough aggregate demand. So if you're not going to have enough monetary easing, if you're not going to have enough fiscal easing, the Eurozone is going to be always borderline in deflation, borderline in recession, and eventually the risk is that one of these parties that are extreme parties of the right or the left might win in those elections, and then one of these countries might eventually exit the Eurozone. It might start with Greece, and eventually you'll have a snowball, and that could be the beginning of the end of the Eurozone. Now, we're here in the United Kingdom, and of course, on a cyclical basis, growth has accelerated in the UK. That's positive. but I will make there also a few caveats. First of all, for a while, the UK tried to go through the route of let's weaken the currency, let's have net export growth, let's have manufacturing growth. And since the Eurozone was in a crisis and the Euro was weakening, the UK gave up on that different growth model. And what they've done, you've gone back to the same old growth model that you had before the crisis, based on consumption and housing, and of course on the important role of London as a major financial center. Last time around, that growth model didn't end very well, and there's already frothiness, for example, in housing in parts of the country. So the question is, going back to the old growth model, does it make sense or not? I would say in the medium term, you want to invest into productivity, into manufacturing, into be able to compete in a wide range of goods and services in the global economy, not just in financial services. Secondly, in spite of strong growth and growth of jobs, there is still malaise in the economy because, of course, most of the jobs created are low value added, low productivity, and low wages. And that's why the average voter says, you're telling me there is strong growth, there is job creation, but they're unhappy. And of course, we don't know yet what are going to be the results of the general elections, but clearly there is still a significant amount of economic dissatisfaction in terms of what's happening to the economy. Now, when you talk about secular stagnation, you might ask yourself what is driving it. And I think that one important interpretation has to do with the rise of income and wealth inequality. I don't want to enter into a discussion of whether inequality is fair or unfair, but think about actually the economic consequences of a rise of inequality. You are transferring income from labor to capital, from wages to profits, from households to corporates, and therefore you are redistributing income from those who have a high marginal propensity to spend, workers, households, consumers, to those who have a lower marginal propensity to spend and a higher marginal propensity to save, that are high net worth individuals and corporations. So you are in a paradox today in advanced economies where corporates are flush with cash, trillions of dollars cash, they're flush with profits, but they're not doing capital spending. And you have to ask yourself why. Now, some people say it's policy uncertainty. Some people say it's regulatory uncertainty. And certainly, that might be part of the story. But part of it is actually that if labor income is not growing, then lack of labor income growth because of rising inequality means less consumption. And if you don't have consumption and you have excess capacity, why a firm would want to invest into new capital stock when there is already excess capacity? So the paradox is that what is rational at the level of an individual firm, you have to survive and thrive. You have to make sure that you achieve the earnings expectation of the city or Wall Street, and therefore you have to cut your labor costs. But your labor costs are somebody else's labor income, and somebody else's labor income is their consumption, and their consumption is what drives demand, and that leads firms that have profits to invest into capital rather than keep that stuff as cash or invest it abroad or keep it abroad or give it back to shareholders already wealthy that doesn't generate consumption. So leaving aside any kind of value judgment, normative about whether inequality is fair or not, from an economic point of view, is one of the reasons why there is not enough demand and you don't have enough consumption growth. And whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the Eurozone, in spite of economic growth, in spite of job creation, people say, my real wages are not growing and that's why I'm unhappy. Certainly, trade and globalization has led to challenges to the income and the jobs of those who are low-skilled workers and even semi-skilled workers. Initially, blue collars, but increasingly also white collars, right? Given the information technologies, not only blue-collar jobs have been outsourced to China and Asia, but now many also of the white-collar jobs can be outsourced. Think about all these services that are provided, business services in places like India or the Philippines and so on. So in the short run, it's trade and globalization that puts at risk jobs and incomes of those who don't have skills. But over time, there's an even more important role of technology, because increasingly technological innovation has become capital intensive, skill bias, and labor savings. So today, a radiologist in Mumbai can do the same job as a radiologist in New York or London for maybe 1/5 of the salary. But tomorrow, I'm sure there'll be a piece of software that's going to do the same job better of looking at your x-rays than any radiologist in New York, London, or Mumbai. So the point is that we're thinking about a brave new future where technology is going to lead to a lot of productivity growth, right? If you talk to people in Silicon Valley, say, we're on the cusp of major innovation, they're going to change the world. We have ET, energy technologies, like shale gas and oil, BT, biotech, biomedical research, gene therapy, healthcare, and you name it, IT, information technologies, like big data, social media, and all the rest, MT, manufacturing technologies like robotic, automation, nanotechnologies. All these things are great. They're going to increase production. They're going to increase profits. They're going to benefit those who are owners of physical and financial capital. They're going to benefit that top 20, 30% of the population who has the skills and is the innovators who are creating those technologies. But increasingly, the jobs of everybody else, middle class, lower skilled, middle skilled, they can be replaced by technology going to disappear over time. So I think that in terms of social policy, that creates a lot of issues that we don't know how to address.